14th and 15th centuries, first under the Angevin kings and later under the 50-year reign of Sigismund Luxembourg, Hungary became one of the most powerful countries of medieval Europe. The kingdom's future path of development was profoundly affected by the external challenge of the Ottoman Turks on the one hand, and the evolution of its political institutions on the other. Increasingly, the position of the monarch weakened as power passed into the hands of the nobility. The death of Sigismund in 1437 was followed by a troubled period when his son-in-law and successor, Albert of Habsburg, died after only 2 years on the throne. For the next 20 years, the kingdom was divided between opposing factions. The court party favored strong royal power and the continuation of Sigismund's Western orientation, while the so-called national or noble party advocated rule through diets. The National Party wanted a southern orientation and a monarch who would march against the Turks. Each party put forward its own candidate for the throne, splitting the country into 2 camps, Habsburg and Jagiellonian. For over 2 decades, much of northern Hungary was ruled in the name of the Habsburgs by the Czech mercenary leader Jiskra. In the larger part of the country, the young and valiant ruler of Poland, Władysław Jagiellon, was elected king. The leading personality of the period was not the king, but one of the main adherents of the noble party, János Hunyadi. Hunyadi's remarkable gifts as a military commander were responsible for his meteoric ascent. The son of an obscure Romanian nobleman, he swiftly rose to important public offices and became one of the largest landowners in the eastern regions of the country. His family seat at Vajda Hunyad in Transylvania was just one of the numerous castles held by him. He used the revenues from his vast domains to create a well-trained mercenary army capable of facing the Turks. The situation was extremely grave after the Ottoman conquest of Serbia unleashed a new wave of raids. Year after year, thousands of captives were dragged off to the slave markets of Asia Minor. Even the strongly fortified cities of Transylvania came under attack. At this critical moment, Hunyadi took over responsibility for the defense of the southern frontier. He became a national hero in 1442 when he annihilated Turkish armies ravaging Transylvania and Wallachia. No Christian commander before Hunyadi had ever defeated the Ottoman war machine in open battle. With the invincible aura of Turkish arms shattered by Hunyadi's stunning victories, the Hungarian army went on the offensive for the first time since the Crusade of Nicopolis. The long campaign of 1443 penetrated deep into Ottoman territory before being halted in the snowbound passes of the Balkan mountains. Hunyadi's name was now on the lips of all Christendom. Never before had the prospects of driving the Turks from Europe appeared so promising. The following year, with the young king at his side, Hunyadi led an international coalition in the direction of the Black Sea, hoping with the assistance of an Italian fleet to relieve the beleaguered city of Constantinople. The fleet promised by Venice never arrived. Instead, Genoese ships ferried the Sultan's soldiers across the straits. The battle, fought at Varna in 1444, ended in a Turkish victory. King Vladislav perished on the battlefield with the greater part of his army. 2 years later, Hunyadi, as the foremost man in the kingdom, was elected regent by the Diet. Determined to liberate Hungary from the Turkish danger, Hunyadi renewed his offensive in 1448. Once again, however, the futility of an anti-Turkish crusade was demonstrated when forces under his command suffered a devastating defeat at Kosovo on the very site of an earlier Turkish victory. In 1456, 3 years after taking the great city of Constantinople, Mohammed the Conqueror launched a large-scale attack against the fortress of Belgrade, the gateway to Hungary. With Belgrade in his possession, the Sultan was confident that he would be in Buda eating his meals in peace in 2 months. Hunyadi immediately responded to the threat by mustering 10,000 soldiers from his estates and retinue. These veteran troops were joined by a mass of 20,000 peasants, roused by the forceful preaching of a Franciscan friar, Giovanni Capistrano, who called for a crusade. Breaking through a blockade of Turkish ships on the Danube, Hunyadi reinforced the besieged garrison of the castle. The defenders withstood an all-out assault on the city and then counterattacked, routing the much larger Turkish army. For the next 65 years, Hungary was spared from a major Ottoman invasion. On the eve of the siege, the Pope had called upon the faithful to pray for the defenders of the fortress and ordered the ringing of church bells at noon. Since that time, the custom has continued in memory of Hunyadi's triumph. At the height of his glory, Hunyadi fell victim to a plague which spread through his camp. His passing was mourned by the whole Christian world. 2 centuries after his death, Turkish soldiers took belated revenge on the one man they feared by defacing his tomb in the Cathedral of Julafehérvár. On the sides of the sarcophagus, original 15th century reliefs commemorate his victories, depicting a triumphal procession of Hungarian horsemen and their captives. Despite Hunyadi's legendary fame, he was never able to unify the faction-torn country. This task was left to his son, Matthias. When the nobility, assembled on the ice of the frozen Danube, elected Hunyadi's 15-year-old son as king in 1458, a great era in the nation's history was inaugurated. In the person of Matthias, the first native Hungarian monarch since the Arpads, Hungary gained a brilliant soldier and statesman. At the very beginning of his reign, he showed his determination to pursue a policy independent of his father's party or the court party. In this way, he was able to gain support from both factions. The young king quickly reasserted royal authority throughout the whole country. Using a combination of force and diplomacy, he recovered the northern Hungarian territories occupied by Jiskra and the Bohemian Hussites. Royal authority was likewise restored in Slavonia and Croatia. The important city of Sopron was also recovered from Austria. Despite these successes, he could not be considered the legitimate king of Hungary until the Holy Crown was placed on his head. During the turbulent period following Sigismund's death, the crown had been taken to Austria and was in the possession of Emperor Frederick III. It was therefore important for Matthias to make peace with Frederick, who was a rival claimant to the throne. In order to regain the crown of the Arpads, Matthias had to pay a high price, not only in money, but also by agreeing that if he died without a legitimate heir, the Hungarian throne would revert to the House of Habsburg. In 1464, the coronation of Matthias finally took place. With his reign secure from any serious challenge, he could now turn his attention to the threatened southern frontier. Although Matthias succeeded in retaking forts in Bosnia, which had fallen into Turkish hands, he refrained from an all-out offensive against the Ottomans. Drawing a lesson from his father's defeats, he concluded that Hungary's military strength was insufficient to expel the Turks from the Balkans. In addition, he realized that outside help from other Christian rulers was an illusion. Adopting Sigismund's defensive strategy, Matthias made peace with the Sultan and secured the southern border by completing the fortress system. Matthias made his power felt instead in the west, where he sought to re-establish the German and Bohemian connection introduced by Sigismund. Like him, he wanted to found a Central European empire. Not wishing to rely solely on the private armies of the barons, the king began to build up a standing army loyal to him alone. Ex-Hussite Bohemian soldiers were recruited to form the core of a multi-ethnic army, which rapidly became one of the most impressive fighting forces of its time. It was comprised of heavy and light cavalry, supported by mobile infantry. This well-trained mercenary force, later called the Black Army, became Matthias's main instrument in expanding Hungarian territory to the north and west. When the Pope proclaimed King George of Bohemia a heretic and stripped him of his crown, Matthias eagerly seized the chance to gain the rich Czech lands. In 1468, he launched an unprovoked attack which escalated into a bloody 10-year war. Although the war left Matthias in possession of Moravia and Silesia, the coveted Bohemian crown eluded him. It went instead to a prince from the Jagiellonian dynasty, who was backed by his father, the King of Poland. With the Czech lands divided between them, both rulers, Vladislav and Matthias, bore the title King of Bohemia. Thus, the Bohemian lion took its place in Matthias's coat of arms, alongside the Hungarian state symbols and the Hunyadi family raven. Throughout his reign, Emperor Frederick had been a thorn in Matthias's side. Now it was the emperor's turn to feel the lances of the Black Army pointed at the Habsburg lands. Foot soldiers, bearing the monogram of Matthias on their shields, marched into Lower Austria. An army of 20,000 men, followed by trains of war wagons, bombards, and catapults, crushed Habsburg resistance in continuous siege warfare. In 1485, at the head of his huge army, Matthias entered Vienna in triumph and took the title Duke of Austria. Training his sights on the imperial crown, he transferred his seat of government from Buda to the Austrian capital. During Matthias's reign, the Kingdom of Hungary reached the zenith of her power and international standing. Matthias was ranked among the greatest monarchs of the day: Louis XI of France, Edward IV of England, and the Turkish Sultan Muhammad the Conqueror. Matthias's firm rule provided an internal stability and security, which stood in marked contrast with the anarchy of the previous period. Among the chief beneficiaries were the peasantry and townspeople. They were especially grateful for his judicial reforms. Abuses were abolished, as a more equitable administration of justice by trained professionals gradually replaced the old feudal courts. Like a true Renaissance monarch, Matthias attempted to establish uniform laws, stamp out corruption, and curb overbearing officials. To achieve his ambitions, he placed the finances of the kingdom on a sounder footing. The maintenance of a mercenary army and the border defense system required enormous sums of money. To raise this revenue, the king imposed a special war tax of 1 gold florin on each peasant household every year, 6 times the amount paid in the time of Sigismund and the Anjous. With an income almost equal to the rulers of France and England, Matthias was able to pursue a great power policy, wage wars, and cover the expenses of a brilliant Renaissance court. Under his enlightened patronage, Hungary became the first center of Italian humanism and Renaissance art north of the Alps. Matthias's enthusiasm for the ideas of the new age is due in large measure to his childhood mentor, János Vitéz, who is justly remembered as the father of Hungarian humanism. As Bishop of Várad, Vitéz made his episcopal court a center of learning that attracted foreign scholars. He sent many students to study abroad at Italian universities. Among them was his nephew, known by his Latin name, Janus Pannonius. Celebrated throughout Italy for his satirical epigrams and eulogies, Pannonius became the first great Hungarian poet and one of the finest writers of his age. With characteristic irony, He gently ridiculed the Renaissance passion for classical antiquity. I've noticed that my poems are thought the less for not being published when Roman consuls ruled. Gray-haired seniority makes everything more valued, and honor comes only after a lengthy course of time. So if ever you read my poems, imagine they are ancient. Then they will seem better. Vitez also saw to it that Matthias received a very thorough Renaissance education. Born in this house in Kolozsvár, Matthias spent his early childhood in Transylvania. While still a young boy, he is said to have been so proficient in Latin that he served as his father's interpreter when Italian ambassadors called at Vita Hunyad Castle. In later life, his knowledge of Latin, Italian, Czech, and German enabled King Matthias to negotiate with foreign emissaries without an intermediary. Able to read the works of antiquity in the original, Matthias became an avid book collector. Inspired by the example of Vitez, he used his wealth to amass a great library of classical Latin and Greek texts. Subsequently known as the Corvinus Library, it became the second largest collection of books in Europe after the Vatican Library. Situated in a wing of the royal palace overlooking the Danube, the library housed over 2,000 sumptuously bound and illuminated manuscripts. The most magnificent of these were decorated by Florentine miniaturists, who painted the royal coat of arms on the margin of each title page. Cameo portraits of the king and queen were entwined among elaborate floral designs. The king appeared in the guise of a Roman emperor. Matthias's symbolic emblems, the hourglass, the well, and of course the raven, were also frequently represented. With his keen interest in military science and politics, the king encouraged the writing of works on history. During his reign, the first printed book, Hesse's Chronicle of Buddha, was published. Despite his strenuous efforts to raise cultural standards, Matthias had little success in spreading literacy among the Hungarian nobility. The large library and the court's generosity, however, attracted humanists from abroad, especially after the king's marriage to a Neapolitan princess, Beatrice of Aragon. Together, they strove to turn Hungary into a second Italy, where, under their patronage, art and architecture flourished. At exorbitant cost, master builders, artists, and craftsmen were imported from the homeland of the Renaissance to reconstruct the royal residence at Buda and Visegrad in the new style. Sigismund's Gothic palace in Buda was embellished with beautifully carved marble. Sadly, only a few fragments, window frames, door frames, and mantelpieces have survived. Enamel stove and floor tiles in a dazzling array of colors added to the magnificence of the decor. Following the introduction of Italian ceramic art, Matthias set up his own workshop in Buda to manufacture pottery, mosaics, and tiles. The courtyard of the Wawel Castle in Krakow makes it possible to imagine how the ceremonial court of Buda which served as its model, must have appeared. Inside Buda Palace, the royal chapel served as the musical center of court life. Singers and musicians from all over Europe, players of the flute, pipe, the lute, and the organ, provided Renaissance pomp for church services and festive occasions. According to the contemporary account of Antonio Bonfini, Matthias's court chronicler, the king searched for people excelling in artisanship everywhere and employed them. He was fond of astronomers, doctors, and mathematicians. Nor did he think low of magicians and jugglers. He never looked down on any kind of skill. To the north of Buda, on the picturesque Danube Bend, excavations have revealed the ruins of Matthias's summer palace at Visegrad. Multi-level terraces follow the undulating slope of the hillside, mixing elements of Gothic and Renaissance architecture. The blend of styles is most evident in the Lion Fountain on the upper level, with its predominantly medieval character. Below, in the very center of the main courtyard, another red marble fountain displays pure Florentine Renaissance features. Atop the fountain, a sculpture of the boy Hercules fighting the nine-headed Hydra once stood. Just as the Greek mythological hero conquered monsters threatening mankind, Italian humanists saw in Matthias a new Hercules who would take on and destroy the Turkish threat. A native Hungarian historian of the period, János Hunyadi, preferred to celebrate Matthias as a second Attila, identifying the Magyars with the world-conquering Huns. Matthias's authoritarian tendencies, however, were less appreciated by the magnates and nobility. Although the king's imposing personality was accepted by the barons, he grew more autocratic with each year. Bypassing both the Diet and royal council whenever possible, he exercised authority by personal decrees. While the peasantry groaned under the heavy tax burden, his costly Bohemian wars provoked strong opposition from the nobility. Many felt that his expansionist aims in the West were motivated by personal ambition, and that he was neglecting the Turkish threat to the country. Who ever heard of Hungarians ruling Czechs, or Czechs Hungarians, a chronicler noted, expressing popular dissatisfaction. Several attempts were made to oust the king. One of the conspiracies was led by his closest advisor, János Vitéz, whom he had elevated to the position of Archbishop of Esztergom. The plot was discovered, Vitéz arrested, and the aged prelate died in disgrace soon afterwards. In the end, Matthias's grandiose political ambitions and wars overstrained the country's resources. When the great king suddenly died in Vienna before his 48th birthday in 1490, his passing was greeted with relief by all classes of society. Only a few years after his death, however, people soon appreciated the order and stability he created. The common people remembered him as the just king, contrasting his reign with the country's rapid decline under the Jagiellonian monarchs. A well-known folk saying lamented, "King Matthias is dead. Justice has departed." The death of Matthias marked the complete collapse of royal power and the rapid disintegration of the powerful kingdom he had created. For 3 decades, the forces of disintegration which had emerged in the mid-15th century had been held in check by his charismatic personality. These forces were now set loose. Matthias wanted to make his illegitimate son János his successor. Fearful of another Hunyadi on the throne, the barons preferred a king whose braids they could hold in their fists. They therefore elected the lax and ineffectual Jagiellonian king of Bohemia, Vladislav II. Unable to speak Hungarian, the Polish-born monarch readily assented to whatever measures the barons proposed. An ideal yes-man, he quickly earned the nickname King Dobrze, after the Polish word for okay. The actual rulers of the country, the great lords, hastened to make peace with the Habsburgs and immediately abandoned all of Matthias's conquests. The weak monarchy was no longer in a position to mobilize the country's resources. Left with an empty treasury, the new king was forced to dissolve the mighty Black Army. Once again, the country's defense rested solely on the private armies of the great lords and the noble levy. The baronial takeover of the kingdom was clearly demonstrated by their control of royal revenues. Overturning all of Matthias's financial reforms, the magnates regained the right to collect taxes on their territories, keeping as much as they could for themselves. As a result, royal income was insufficient to cover the cost of maintaining the border defense system, let alone the expenses of a court. It was said that, on occasion, the king's chefs had to borrow food to serve His Majesty's dinner. The political scene was dominated by wealthy magnates like the Zápolya family, who were the largest landowners in the country, and rich prelates like the Archbishop of Esztergom, Tamás Bakacs. With his enormous income, Bakacs continued the Renaissance tradition initiated by King Matthias. The magnificent red marble chapel which he erected in Esztergom at the beginning of the 16th century is an enduring testimony to his refined taste. Equally impressive is the late Gothic splendor of the Zápolya burial chapel and tombstones in the Szepes region of Upper Hungary. Throughout the prospering towns of the north, a firmly established tradition of Gothic painting and sculpture continued to flourish during the 15th and early 16th centuries. The idealized conventions of beautiful Madonnas in rippling drapery gave way to more individualized features. Biblical stories began to include recognizable details of everyday life. Among the favorite subjects depicted on the altar wings were the lives of popular saints such as Nicholas and Martin, who took pity on the poor, the sick, and the crippled. The emotional intensity of Christ's passion was emphatically expressed in late Gothic sculpture emanating from the German lands. Dramatic, disquieting, and often gruesome in their details, such wood carvings became a universal expression of personal suffering at the wane of the Middle Ages. The most powerful interpretation of the Calvary theme came from the hand of an artist known only by his initials. Influenced by Dürer and other Northern Renaissance artists, the MS master's incisive lines and subtle coloring distinguish him as the most outstanding painter of medieval Hungary. Panel paintings were frequently combined with gilt polychrome sculptures to form elaborate altars. One of the most unusual pieces of late Gothic sculpture to survive, the Lord's Coffin, was used during Easter week services. On the sides of the movable catafalque, carved reliefs of guards keep watch. In front, the three Marys appear before the empty tomb. Above, figures of the 12 apostles decorate the richly ornamented canopy. The highest achievement of late Gothic wood carving is the monumental altar created by Master Paul in the parish church of Lecce. The realistic details of the apostles placed Master Paul's sculpture on the borderline of Gothic and Renaissance art. Choosing his models from local inhabitants, he imbued his nativity figures with the folk character of Slovak mountain shepherds. The final decades of medieval Hungary were marked by continual conflicts between cliques of magnates and their supporters. Thousands of armed nobles assembled in mass diets held in open fields on the outskirts of Pest and other towns. Here they engaged in noisy politicking and voiced their opposition to any reform threatening their golden liberties. In the absence of an effective policy, they trumpeted the martial virtues of Scythian valor, but their empty rhetoric provided no defense against the mounting Ottoman threat. Motivated by xenophobic and anti-German sentiments, the National Party passed a resolution in the Diet of 1505 barring the election of any further foreigners to the Hungarian throne. In response, the court turned to the Habsburgs for support. Ignoring the ruling of the Diet, a marriage and succession contract was concluded in 1515 between Vladislav II and Emperor Maximilian, confirming the earlier inheritance treaties of 1491 and 1506. The Archduke of Austria, Ferdinand Habsburg, was engaged to Vladislav's daughter Anna, while Vladislav's son Louis was betrothed to Ferdinand's sister Mary. If Louis died without an heir, the Hungarian throne would pass to the House of Habsburg. Most of Hungary's foreign trade was already dominated by South German capital. The kingdom's most important resource, its mines, was no exception. In 1475, János Hunyadi, in association with the merchants of Krakow, began to free the mines of Upper Hungary from flooding by introducing water wheels and other machinery needed for deep mining operations. When his capital proved insufficient for the massive investment required, he turned to the greatest banker of the day, Jakob Fugger. In 1494, Fugger and Hunyadi established the world's first multinational company for the export of copper from Beszterce and other Slovakian mining centers. The profits from their enormous transactions ran into millions of florins, but since the ore was exported unprocessed to German foundries, little economic benefit was derived by the native inhabitants, who remained a poor nation in a rich country. Utterly dependent on Fugger's loans, the Hungarian court had little choice but to confirm his mining monopoly. The nobles, for their part, had little use for merchants or bankers. While they had no idea how to manage the economy, they were determined to increase their privileged position at the expense of the peasantry and the cities. Demand for agricultural products triggered a price revolution at the end of the 15th century. This encouraged feudal landowners to participate in wine and grain trade. Instead of a fixed rent in cash, the landowners sought a greater share of the peasants' crops, which they could sell at a good profit. As a consequence of this changed mentality, Hungary and other countries in East Central Europe began a slow evolution toward a serf labor economy. At a time when serfdom was disappearing in Western Europe, a French traveler observed, "The Hungarian noble considers the field workers no better than cattle and treats them accordingly." With the king powerless to intervene, legislation passed by the Diet resulted in the rapid deterioration of the lower classes. The right of peasants to move from one lord to another, or from their village to a market town, was greatly restricted. Other customary rights of the peasantry were curtailed as well. For example, a 1504 law prohibited peasants from hunting or fowling in the local forests. The nobles also attempted to downgrade the privileges of the cities and lessen competition from market towns. Nobles were exempt from paying custom duties, while peasants and townsmen had to pay tolls when bringing their goods to market. The inequality between noble and non-noble status was most strongly felt by the richer peasants of market towns. Simmering peasant discontent exploded in the hot summer of 1514. After renewed Ottoman attacks imperiled the security of the kingdom, Pope Leo X granted a bull to his one-time rival, Cardinal Bakos, authorizing him to organize a crusade against the Turks. A huge army of peasants and freemen was placed under the command of George Doja, an experienced captain who had distinguished himself in the Ottoman border wars. The march of the Crusader army to the south was accompanied by growing tension between nobles and peasants. Following attacks on manor houses, the lords forced the king to suspend the campaign. By this time, however, the crusade had turned into a peasant war against the nobles. Denouncing the intolerable conditions of the peasantry, Doja openly called for the abolition of noble privileges. The insurgents wanted to be freemen, subject only to the king. Although Hungary had witnessed a peasant revolt in 1437 that was brutally suppressed, it had been restricted to northern Transylvania. By contrast, in 1514, nearly the whole central part of the kingdom was set alight with the flames of rebellion. The market towns of the Great Plain played a prominent role in the uprising. Magnates and nobles quickly joined forces against the revolt. The governor of Transylvania, János Hunyadi, attacked and defeated Doja's forces at Temesvar. Doja and other leaders were taken prisoner and horribly tortured. Accused of wanting to be king, Doja was made to sit on a red-hot iron throne while a fiery crown was placed upon his head. His starved companions were forced to bite into his burning flesh. Thousands of peasants paid with their lives for their part in the uprising. Collective punishment of the entire peasantry soon followed, as the Diet condemned them to perpetual servitude. The laws of 1514 decreed that each peasant would owe 1 day a week of unpaid labor, that peasants couldn't move from one lord to another, and that they were forbidden to bear arms. Although these laws could not be effectively enforced at the time, a precedent was established which condemned the majority of the population to more than 300 years of ruthless exploitation. The complete dominance of the nobility over other social classes was codified by a brilliant lawyer, István Verbóczy, who became one of the leading political figures in the aftermath of the Peasant War. His authoritative three-part legal handbook, the Tripartitum, compiled the customary laws of the country. While never officially proclaimed by the Diet, Verbóczy's book became the Bible of the nobility and remained the basis of legal practice until 1848. By the time Vladislav's 10-year-old son, Louis II, ascended the throne in 1516, the border defense system established by Sigismund was in complete disarray. Frontier garrisons were left without pay, and fortresses fell into ill repair. The country's slow and inefficient feudal armies, which took many weeks to mobilize, were no longer any match for the Ottoman war machine. With the last remnants of Serbia and Bosnia, together with Wallachia, Moldavia, Syria, and Egypt incorporated into the Ottoman Empire, the strategic position of Hungary reached the point of no return. In 1521, Suleiman the Magnificent hurled the might of his vast empire against the gateway to Hungary. With no relief force in sight, Belgrade capitulated after an 8-week siege. Following the fall of Belgrade, the frontier defense system collapsed, leaving Hungary at the mercy of the Sultan. Alarmed by the gravity of the situation, Louis vainly appealed for outside help. We are sinking, my holy father," he wrote in one of his last letters to the Pope. "The Turkish Sultan, collecting all his power from Asia and Europe, is coming against us." When Suleiman finally launched his long-expected invasion in April 1526, the Diet was more preoccupied with party quarrels than the defense of the kingdom. Like the stunned watchman on the Lord's coffin, it seemed that nothing could shake the country from its lethargy. The atmosphere of paralysis was vividly characterized by the papal legate in Buda. If Hungary could be saved from this great danger by 3 florins, you probably couldn't find 3 men who would give his share of the florins. The lords are afraid of each other, the king of all of them. There is no order, no preparation, no captains, no money, no ships. Even the instinct of self-preservation has died out in many. After waiting months for noble contingents to assemble, Louis finally set off from Buda to meet Suleiman's host. On August 29, 1526, at Mohács, an ill-prepared army of 25,000 Hungarians and foreign mercenaries attacked a vastly superior Turkish force, 3 times their size. Covered in iron from top to toe, the Hungarian knights broke through the first line of the Ottoman battle formation, only to be decimated by the massed artillery and musket fire of the Janissaries. The unequal battle quickly turned into a massacre. In less than 2 hours, half of the Hungarian army was slaughtered. Among the dead lay many leading dignitaries of the kingdom, including 7 bishops. While fleeing the battlefield, the young king fell from his horse and drowned under the weight of his armor in a marshy brook. Unopposed, the Sultan's army advanced up the Danube to loot the defenseless capital Buda before returning home with tens of thousands of miserable captives, doomed to a life of slavery. The catastrophic defeat at Mohács left an indelible impression in the collective memory of Hungarians. Through the ages, the battleground has loomed as a mournful reminder of the loss of national independence. For the death of Louis opened the door to 4 centuries of Ottoman and Habsburg domination. As a 19th century poet expressed it, Mohács was the graveyard of our national greatness.